Housekeeping, we are in a webinar format, so you all came in with your microphones off and your cameras off. We had about 50 folks register for this call, which is can be a really big Zoom meeting. So to ensure we can hear everybody and be respectful, we set it up as a webinar format. You can ask your questions in the Q&A box, which you should see on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom. That way the questions will go directly to our panelists. You can also utilize the chat box. You should have an ability to change who you chat to. You can chat to all the panelists, or you should have an option to chat to panelists and attendees if you have something you want to share with everyone. When you ask a question and you put it in the Q&A box, if we have follow-up, we will mostly answer all of them live. This way our panelists will have the option to write directly on your question. If we need clarification on your question, or if you have something you want to say on speaker, we can unmute you to speak if we are confused or need further clarification. So feel free to utilize the chat box and the Q&A box with us this evening, and our plan is to wrap up by 8 o'clock. So who are our panelists this evening? We have 3 wonderful local, I say soil and agricultural experts with us this evening. The first I'm going to introduce you to is Doug Horn. Doug works with Virginia Cooperative Extension. He received a bachelor's degree in agronomy and a master's degree in soil fertility from Virginia Tech. The majority of his career was in the turf industry. Doug has a family beef cow-calf operation located in Northwest Augusta County. He has stayed active on the family farm throughout his career. Doug has been an extension agent with the Virginia Cooperative Extension for about 7 years. He is the crop and soils agent for the Central Shenandoah Valley housed in Augusta County. Part of his extension responsibility is to serve as the executive secretary of the Virginia No-Till Alliance. The Virginia No-Till Alliance exists to maximize farm productivity and profitability by promoting successful implementation of continuous no-till systems through shared ideas, technology, conservation, and education. The Virginia No-Till Alliance is also known by the acronym Vantage. Vantage has conducted research projects such as characterizing winter cover crops, examining the feasibility of manure injection, and the use of summer cover crops after wheat. Doug currently serves as a director on the Headwaters Soil and Water Conservation District Board and previously served on the Mountain Soil and Water Conservation District Board. Our next panelist is Robert Clemmer. Robert is the farm manager at Project Grows in Verona. Robert grew up in Stanton and after college spent time working outdoors with conservation programs in northern New Mexico, Arizona, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. After adventuring in Alaska as a dog musher, Robert discovered a passion for farming as an environmental educator at the Rock Eagle 4-H Center in Georgia, managing the farm at their history site. In 2018, Robert moved back home and is continuing his farming journey. Robert has a degree in history and a degree in classical studies from Hampton-Sydney College. He is also a master gardener and has a blue ribbon for his tomatoes. When he's not on the farm, Robert is either playing mandolin, trail running, 3D printing, or spending time with his dogs. And our third panelist is Alexandra Schmidt. Alexandra is a resource soil scientist with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. Alexandra is from southeastern Pennsylvania and joined the NRCS through a college internship. She recently earned her master's in the Crop and Environmental Soil Science Department at Virginia Tech and is an associate professional soil scientist through the Soil Science Society of America. She loves being a soil scientist because it combines all sorts of sciences from geology to hydrology to biology and physics. And lastly, a little bit about myself. I am Rachel Winter with the Headwaters Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm originally from Frederick, Maryland, where I grew up on my family's dairy farm. I graduated from Bridgewater College with a degree in environmental science and a wildlife emphasis. I have been with Headwaters Soil and Water Conservation District since 2018 as our education specialist and conservation technical assistance. In 2020, my duties expanded to include our workplace coordinator. I also serve on the Valley Conservation Council's Land Protection Committee. Living the past 6 years in the Shenandoah Valley, I have fallen in love with the sense of place that I feel with this unique landscape and the communities that you all as people bring to it. I currently live in Waynesboro with my husband and 2 cats, and in my spare time, you can find me on the South River Greenway, baking or curled up with a good book. So these are the folks that you'll be hearing from today. As we get started, again, the majority of our time is going to be focused on hearing from you all what your thoughts are on the film, what questions, what left you wanting to know more, what left you with farther ways to increase your knowledge about soil health, about carbon sequestration, about climate change, about our local food systems. You know, the movie really touched on a lot of subjects, so we're going to try to work with what we can do. So to get us kind of started and get our brains thinking, I have a few poll questions for you all. So I'm getting ready to launch our first poll, which you should see now. What is your overall thoughts on the film? What did you think? Everybody should have gotten a link when they registered to watch the film if you did not have a Netflix subscription. Give folks a minute to get those in. All right, I see your results are slowing down. So let me share the results with you all. As you can see, a lot of folks, we had good things about the movie. Lots of us learned a lot. We really enjoyed it. There's a few that we're not sure how we really felt about it. Not sure if we would watch it again, but like I agree with you all. I did learn a lot from this film. I appreciated all of the different caveats they went into, and hope you did as well. I think it was really well done. Okay, and one more to get our brains thinking. Just so that us as panelists can kind of gauge our audience, we kind of want to know where you're from. Are you local? Are you not local? Okay, everybody answered that one quickly. And so the majority of us are joining from Stanton today, but we also have a lot of us that are not local. So if you are not local and you want to share where you're from, feel free to put that in the chat box if you want to. But that way we just kind of, as panelists, if they use some local examples so that you all can connect with that. Awesome. All righty. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in case our panelists want to show anything while we are discussing, and we're going to move into the Q&A portion of our time with us. We already have some questions coming in. We actually have somebody joining us from Chicago, Illinois, so that is the wonders of technology, that if we were doing this in person, that would not be the case. Our first question for you all comes from Susan Beachy. And she asks, what can we do to increase local exchange between consumers and growers and ranchers? Let you all think on that. We are going to answer that one live. I've let you all think, and I'm going to popcorn to Robert if you want to take this first, and then Alexandra and Doug, feel free to chime in if you have thoughts as well.
Okay, I feel like whenever I say 5 minutes from now, I'm going to feel like I have a way better answer for this. But I feel like a lot of it, so what do you do to increase, let me read the question again. What do you do to increase local exchange between consumers and growers? So part of it, I think, is first out, go out and seek that food. That food exists, and definitely in places, getting that food is a lot harder. But they exist, and I feel like a lot of us, that's one of the first easy things to do is just kind of do some research on and ask yourselves, where's our food come from? And if you kind of like the idea of getting your food local and supporting someone nearby that's growing your food, then kind of going out and discovering it. There are farmers markets that are around where a lot of these places are happening, and there are other stores around in the area that they kind of support these. But for people to kind of get to these places, that can kind of be an issue too. So what do we do to kind of increase this? I mean, definitely first off, just support it. And it's kind of like build it, they will grow. If you keep supporting it, it will exist more, and there will be more of it.
Alexandra, Doug, any thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important for the consumer themselves to reach out and to try to, find and talk to these farmers. But I think folks from a policy standpoint really need to do more of getting local products available commercially, like in the community, because, the easiest thing you can do for families who might not have the time to get to the farmer's market on Saturday, is to bring those products to places that they would be routinely grocery shopping anyway. That is a big challenge, but something that if we had more of, I think you'd really have more engagement between farmers and the community in general.
Great. Okay. Any other thoughts? If not, we'll move on to our next question, which comes from Renee Ramirez, and we might need some further clarification on this one. She's asking, are the farmers being cited for still using chemicals on their farms? Renee, I don't know if you want to comment, if you have further clarification on that.
That was going to be my first comment. What's your definition of chemical? And what angle you're coming from? If you're looking at an organic operation versus a traditional operation, they still use chemicals. They just have a different name and a different source. So a good example is table salt is an organic weed killer, but it is actually sterilizing the soil and killing the plants, where another pesticide may be organic based in a chemical sense. It's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen with some side groups, and it can be biodegradable. But a direct answer, no, farmers are not penalized for using products. They're strictly regulated. They are penalized if they're used off-label or on a crop that's not specified on that label. And every product that's used on agricultural production has tolerance limits and reentry levels and harvest intervals. So it's highly regulated, but if a farmer goes out and uses a pesticide in a legal label manner, there is no punishment or penalty or anything in there of that manner.
Renee said that it's the chemical that causes cancer mentioned in the video.
That would be Roundup.
Roundup. Yeah, no, that's still widely used, and folks are not being cited for that, as long as what Doug said, it's being used in the proper way.
Yeah, the other thing, and they were very careful to say in the video, is it may cause cancer. The scientific evidence and the standpoint of the Environmental Protection Agency is that it is not a carcinogen. So they danced around the argument with their language.
Thank you all. Our next question comes from Kay. I'm hoping I pronounced your name right, Du Bois. With the changes of the techniques used in the documentary, would the techniques also help the soil ground in more desert areas such as Arizona, New Mexico, where the area is more dry and more compacted than the areas mentioned in the documentary? I'll let you think on that. Robert, I know you have some experience in that area.
Your time to shine.
Yeah, and shout out to all the Mary Baldwin students that are watching this who have helped out at Project Grows the past week and next week. It's Kai Dubois. But yeah, lived out in New Mexico for spent 4 summers out in New Mexico, and that's when I kind of, I had this history and classical studies background, and then going into this conservation program, and there was a lot of environmental science all at once. It was so fascinating. It was very eye-opening. And I remember one of the first things, this was the Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, but tons of mountains for backpacking and everything in northern New Mexico. But part of the scout operation was that they had a cattle ranch there. And I remember the conservation director taking me out, and he was just kind of asking me about this field where they were pasturing all the cattle. And he goes, "What do you notice about it?" I was like, "I guess it's really short, kind of like a short lawn." He goes, "It's not supposed to be that way." And so the idea that something was being overgrazed, I'm a history major, so I'm not necessarily a scientist, but the idea, I remember like the idea of more trees, more biodiversity, the thing with deserts and desertification is the idea that you're losing all these things that kind of hold moisture in. And so the idea of creating more biodiversity and what's appropriate with, and what works here in Virginia might not necessarily work in New Mexico or a completely different climate, but just kind of promoting that biodiversity in an area not only helps with the soil, but just everything that's impacted about.
I can comment too, Rachel.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, awesome job, Robert. So what would really help with those type of environments, cover cropping, which they covered extensively in that documentary, when you create like a living mulch or just like the more cover you can have on the soil, when it rains, the soil is protected from like evaporation. So you can really keep the soil more cool and in those desert environments, like keep water in. And then on top of that, the more organic matter you have, organic matter is like a little sponge. It's really likes to hold water, so it helps the soil's ability to retain that water, like in the rooting zone where your crop would be. So that's another useful technique in those arid environments as well.
Great. Our next question comes from Jan Mangun. And this question can actually really also relate to us that have our own personal gardens and vegetable gardens, flower gardens as well. She asked, since pesticides are not recommended, what are some options to get rid of yard pests such as moles, voles, and grubs that tend to kill off our plants and grasses? Let you all think on that. Doug, do you want to take a try first?
I guess since I have the turf background, I can start. That's a tough one. Unfortunately, for the moles and voles, the standard answer is going to be trapping. You physically remove them, whether it's with a live trap or mortality. This canned answer for most turf questions is create a healthy turf environment. So that means good soil fertility, proper pH range, make the environment conducive to growing good grass. A lot of the problems take advantage of stressed grasses. Your weed pressures are higher. Some of your insect pressures can be greater under certain conditions. Things like grubs, a healthy turf can handle a pretty good population. And then your choice of grass types. If a low maintenance, something like zoysia grass would be less desirable to certain pests as opposed to a tall fescue or bluegrass. The fine fescues don't seem to have quite the disease pressures as some of the others. So it goes back to your objectives. And if you do get disease, insect pressure that significantly affects the lawn, you'd probably be in an overseeding situation if you wanted to minimize your use of pesticides.
I have an idea too, but Robert, I saw you just unmuted if you want to go.
You go first.
Okay, so what I was kind of thinking is something a little bit different, maybe in a radical way, but I would get Allard. Your lawn is Jan, but trying to create an environment for more of an agro ecosystem predators. So like getting some bat boxes, or well, bats don't eat voles, but owl boxes installed might help kind of take care of that issue a little bit. That's kind of my thought. What do you think, Robert?
So I like the idea of a predator. I was going to say get a cat, but the idea of getting some sort of predator, or what Doug said too, getting a trap. That was the first thing. We're trying to trap this groundhog that's getting into our chard now. But the idea too of just making sure that things are healthy, because pests like kind of that distress thing. Notice that a lot of the pests on plants, they're going on this, they're attacking the sickly ones. The healthy plants can kind of resist and overcome that, but all the sick ones, and so you get less sick ones by promoting that good soil health. But then also piggybacking off the two of you all with the idea of just everything's healthy, and just that biodiversity, bat boxes and owls, or all the other things that come. I'm sorry, I took a master gardener class, but I didn't pay attention to the grass class. So whatever comes with that, but just trying to build all these things. And so, for instance, when we have tomato hornworms on tomatoes, there is this predatory wasp, part of this ecosystem, predatory wasp that will lay its eggs and kill the worms, and we don't have to spray or worry with some of them, because there are other elements in this ecosystem that are taking care of these problems.
Thank you, guys. Our next question, if you all can see, comes from Caroline Sheridan. What do you see as a way forward to move our society from the feedlots that they kind of shown in the film, served by monocultural industrial farm models, to regenerative farms demonstrated in the film? What you all think? I know none of you really have an animal background. Doug, since you've got a family farm, I don't know if you want to start with this.
I guess I would look at the reason we evolved that way was probably a lot of economies of scale. And it's per unit production cost goes down when you get those high concentrations. Unfortunately, there's other problems, particularly environmental, that can suffer. One thing I was hoping would come out of this whole COVID pandemic was it really undermined our vulnerability on using nationwide production systems in place of local systems. And the shortcoming in the valley, we've got plenty of cows and poultry and so forth. The limiting factor was the slaughterhouses and the way to process. And right now, there's still a significant gap between mass production and local production. So it's going to, going to take a long time, and consumers can impact that if they demand a local resource done in a certain way and they're willing to pay the price. Short term, there will be a significant price differential. So it's not going to be for everybody, but that's a start.
Tell if somebody was trying to unmute themselves or not. While we're kind of on this subject of regenerative agriculture, I'm gonna skip around a little bit for you panelists that you can see in the Q&A box. There's a lot of questions surrounding regenerative agriculture. First, we're gonna start with Pamela Wagner's question of what is each of your definitions of regenerative agriculture? And is the film correct in implying that regenerative agriculture can be a solution to climate change? That's a really thinking question. I'll let you all think a little bit. And Jan also added a question: what percentage of farmers in our area are using regenerative methods as demonstrated in the film? So I don't know if you all want to kind of include that in your answer, but the main question would be, what is each of your definitions of regenerative agriculture? And is the film implying it correctly as a solution for climate change?
So I'm thinking about the last question, and I'm thinking about these questions, and the amount of times, like, so from a soil scientist standpoint, the soils in the Midwest are just some of our best, in the Corn Belt are awesome because they were prairies for really long time, since after the Ice Age. So they had, tons of continuous living roots. Bison would come and mob graze and move on. And sometimes I just stay up at night thinking, why couldn't we just put cattle on, like, take them out of corn, put it in grass, let's graze it. I don't know how we can get there, but it's something that I hope to see a little bit more of in my lifetime. But my definition of regenerative agriculture is, agriculture that exists within the local ecosystem, trying to build that soil carbon back, giving back to pollinators and wildlife, and feeding the communities in a healthy way. My whole reason I got into farming was because I used to volunteer on a biodynamic farm, which had residents with developmental disabilities. And it was in high school, and I didn't really know anything, or I didn't think twice about the soil, but I was weeding and I was like, man, this soil is like black. I'm like, what in the heck is going on? This is awesome. Later, when I got into soil science, that kind of clicked for me. I was like, oh my gosh, like, they had healthy soil. They were able to grow healthy food, which had this healthy, beautiful, thriving community. And to me, that just seemed like it all made sense. So I don't really know what that means, but whatever that is, that's regenerative agriculture to me. Thanks.
That was an awesome answer. Just kind of piggyback off of that, I've heard something before. I guess I'll use that as my definition of regenerative agriculture, is the idea if your farm isn't part of the ecosystem, it's part of the problem. And then to go on the opposite scale, my first big farm experience was down in Georgia. And when they're talking about, when you hear about the red clay, they're not kidding. It is red clay. And so learning about all of that as a history major of how they grew a bunch of tobacco and cotton, and it used to be just nothing but pines. It used to be nothing but oak, is this giant hardwood forest. And then it all got clear cut for tobacco and cotton. And they did that for about 100 years. And then boll weevils, and then just red clay. And so this quarter acre that I was working, it had been a garden for maybe 3 or 4 years prior. And there were definitely still areas where if it wasn't watered, it'd be hard as a rock. There'd be times where you just be stained red. And I spent 3 years there, and we experimented with cover crops. We experimented with tons of compost, tons of mulch, just trying to keep it covered all the time. Sometimes we just there was like a bunch of weeds and we had nothing, no idea what to plant. We just keep it in weeds just to keep something covered. And after 3 years, I mean, there's still like red clay, and I think the soil in Virginia, the soil where we're at, is way better. But you definitely notice that the soil had improved over a couple of years. But along with that too, it's just like all the other elements of this ecosystem, all the beneficial insects and all the beneficial creatures, and then unfortunately all the not beneficial ones. But it was cool to have all of that happen and not just indiscriminately spray pesticide all over the place.
Yeah, if you're driving by a crop field and you see red or orange at the surface, that's not okay. Makes me sad.
So I guess I'm the one left. So I guess to me, I'll go through a background of my mindset. So I'm going to say we had a concept of subsistence farming, and that's where you minimize inputs and you take what you can to show some kind of a profit, and you just get by. Then the idea of sustainable agriculture came about. And in my mind, that's staying neutral, breaking even. Your inputs back to the soil are going to equal what you're taking off. So in my mind, the regenerative is if you're finding a way to put back more than you're taking off. And hopefully that would build the situation that Robert and Alexandria alluded to. So the other part of, was this the one about the commercial, what's being done in the valley for regenerative? We're doing a lot of things, especially when you get out and see other parts of the country. We've always lumped it under the buzzword of soil health. So regenerative agriculture isn't one practice. It isn't growing cover crops. It's a whole host of no-till is a big contribution. Just the less you disturb the soil. And I think the movie hit that very hard about the negative impacts of tillage. So just going to no-till is a step in the right direction. The cover crops, another step in the right direction. Multi-species cover crops might be another step. Crop rotation. Maybe we're doing a monoculture, but we're doing it one growing season at a time. So it's a different crop the next cycle. We've got guys planting green. We may not have the grazing of our crop fields, but with our intensive agriculture, we're taking the manure and putting it back on the fields. So, it's coming from the fields, it's going back to the fields. We're looking at liquid manure injection so that we reduce our losses from it. We reduce the soil, the volatilization and the runoff potential. We're promoting pre-side dress nitrogen testing. So that instead of putting a whole bunch of fertilizer out there at one time when you plant, you're going in at least 2 or maybe more applications so that the plant is utilizing the nutrient when it needs it. So there's a whole host of things that we are actually doing. And it's just incremental improvements. And some people are more in tune and doing more of the practices. And that, I think, is the education and is part of my job, is to try to push people to adopt more practices that'll be a long-term regenerative agriculture.
Can I ask Doug a question? Rachel?
Sure. And then we're going to move on to another hot topic that's coming up. So we'll move on after that.
So just quick, Doug, do you mind commenting? Because something really stood out to me about this film, and that's like, in the beginning, they were talking about all of the toxins associated with herbicides and pesticides. Like, they're very heavy on that, and then immediately pivoted to no-till agriculture and all the benefits of it without explaining that no-till agriculture is only possible with herbicides unless somehow you can roller crimp, which is not easy to widely adopt. So like, did you notice that? And if you did, you know, what, or just in general, what are your thoughts about that? Because I think it's kind of not okay to do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, yes, I did pick up on that. And there's several other instances where they're kind of giving two opposing stories on a subject. But with the no-till agriculture at our current state, it was all made possible by herbicides. Basically, the concept, it may have been in the late 60s, but in the valley by the mid 70s, we were starting to get pretty good adoption of it. And at that time, we were letting the rye grow up to a fairly mature stage. It would be up to your armpits. It would be pollinating and going to head. And then they would come through and plant the corn in it. And they were utilizing paraquat, which is a very toxic chemical in terms of mammalian toxicity. And it was a contact herbicide, and it would burn it down, but it wouldn't necessarily keep it down. So when glyphosate, also known as Roundup, initially patented as Roundup, became available in 1975, it just totally changed, because here we had a herbicide that was low mammalian toxicity. It did not have residual in the soil. It was biodegraded. It only killed green tissue. It would not kill other organisms. And it really made no-till possible. It really took off from there. And that's been the heavy reliance on your weed control, because when you grow those nice cover crops, you've got to suppress them. We can use rolling, crimping, flail mowing. There are termination techniques that will work. They are only good for maybe 2 or 3 cycles. And at some point, you get to a point where the weed pressure gets so great that you typically have to go back to a herbicide application, or in the case of organic farming, it's tilling. Tilling is the weed control for organic. So which is worse, releasing the carbon immediately through tillage, or having a pesticide such as glyphosate to do the work for you periodically throughout your cycle, whether it's on an annual basis or every 2 or 3 years. So yeah, it's interesting concept. And I kind of walk the line of, it should be a tool. It shouldn't be the only tool, and it shouldn't be a heavily dependent. So the other shortcoming in some of these cycles is, yes, you can roll down some 6-foot high rye or your legume crimson clover, but then you may have to use the glyphosate to establish your cover crop. So it's probably going to be in there at some point to get the nice results that you're looking at with the growing green manure, organic residue, whatever you want to call it.
Thank you. That was a good perspective.
That's a good segue. We're getting a lot of questions in about carbon sequestration. So I'm going to start. I know Alexandra and I talked about this topic, so she's going to be ready to roll. Start with a kind of a broader question. Rose is asking that they mentioned a lot about carbon sequestration in the film, but how good is the data behind what they were implying in the film?
Wow. So there's a lot of data behind that statement. So carbon sequestration in healthy soils. So really what that means is anytime, like if you remember the rancher who was just like, yes, when my cows come and they graze this grass down, the roots kind of slough off. It's kind of just the plant's response physiologically to like that grazing pressure. And then she's like, oh, now it's just like carbon in my soil. So what carbon sequestration really is like building soil organic matter. I was thinking about how much I would love to throw some numbers out there. Like if you increase your soil organic matter by 1%, you can get X tons of carbon or like CO2 sequestered, but that's kind of tough to do because not all soils are the same. So like a real sandy soil, has more challenges sequestering carbon than the soil here in the valley, which is a little bit more of a finer texture. But there's tons of research going into this stuff all the time. And, I have some friends who are pessimists about, the farming not getting better, things not getting better. But the truth is, one of the things that's really going to fuel this is the carbon market. So farmers who are practicing regenerative agriculture, if they can prove quantitatively, well, I gained 1% of soil organic matter, they might get credits that they could then sell, to make profit off of to offset, some other activity somewhere else for like some sort of industry or something like that. So I can only imagine there'll be a lot more research going on into carbon sequestration in the near future. There's some really exciting stuff happening for sure in this area.
Thanks, Alexandra. And while we're on that topic, Olivia was looking into some research on specific plants. She was looking at kudzu because it grows so fast. She thought it could pull down carbon, but then she got to thinking, is it true that there are certain plants that are unsuitable ground covers to help with the sequestration, with carbon drawdown?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend planting kudzu anymore. I wouldn't plant kudzu. Oh man, as far as things for, I don't know, don't plant kudzu. Sorry, I can't answer the other one.
The other part of her question was then, are there some plants that aren't suitable ground cover to help with carbon drawdown?
Yeah, so the reason we're like giggling a little bit is because if you've ever driven on some of the interstates, there's that big viney plant that's just swallowing trees up alive. That's kudzu. Kudzu actually does some funky stuff. I mean, you would think it'd be good, and I think that's why it was introduced, because it's actually a legume, so it fixes nitrogen, which is cool, but when it grows out of control like that, it's super invasive and, it can be really damaging to the ecosystem. But if you're looking for other plants to grow instead that are good, just like if you go to like most stores now, or just Google like diverse cover crop mix, like you could do clovers and some rye. You can mix some vetch in there, just like a good, maybe some mustards or tillage radish, just like you want something really diverse to get a lot of good biomass in there. And then it'll have like a multitude of really good effects, like brassicas like mustard can help with nematode suppression, tillage radish can reduce compaction, things like that. So I would reach out to folks like Doug with Extension who could like maybe help recommend some things like that. Master gardeners are also just like tremendously awesome resources in that area.
Okay, now I'm piggybacking off Alexander's. Yeah, we have 2 fields out in cover crop right now. And it's really pretty because the crimson clover is flowering, and there's this radish or mustard, or I think there's some kind of field turnip in there, and that's flowering now too. But there's a mix of like hairy vetch, ryegrass that's in there, but just kind of this cover crop mix. We have this one high tunnel out right now. And once we pull all our peas, oh, by the way, all the legumes, if you're like gardening and you're trying to do rotational gardening, doing a bunch of legumes, one spot legumes help build up the soil and can do good things with that. We have this high tunnel right now with a bunch of peas in there. And then once we pull all those out, this summer, it's just going to be planted out with buckwheat, which is a good cover crop, but it's good for, it can kind of withstand that summer heat. And then I think the fall we're cover cropping. What are we cover cropping? I think the same thing that we're cover cropping with now.
Awesome. So while we kind of had our brain around kudzu and being an invasive plant species, we have another invasive question from Fred, who's asking, since invasive species have become quite an issue, not just here in the Shenandoah Valley, but all over the world. How do you suggest that on a national level, as well as a global level, we take care of these invasive species? That's a really broad question, gets you all thinking.
I guess technically, we do have some kind of protocols in place. Any products coming from overseas are supposed to go through a quarantine process if they contain any plant or animal material. Unfortunately, the volumes coming in are so great that it's easy for something to slip through. Some of the good examples I can think of recently is the Japanese stilt grass. It came in as packing material in crates from China. And obviously some of it was in mature seeds present, and you get a few of them out there, next thing you know, we got a significant issue with it. So what's so bad about Japanese stilt grass? It just, once it gets established, it is so thick, like the kudzu, it just chokes out all the native vegetation, and then we start losing our species diversity. And I'm not talking about plants, I'm talking about insects, birds, mammals, and it impacts the whole ecosystem. This spotted lanternfly is another excellent example. It was first found in the United States, I believe, in 2016, maybe 2014. And it was an egg mass came in on a pallet of stone from China. And they hatched and multiplied. And now it's a major issue in Pennsylvania, and it is encroaching in Virginia, and it has been found in Augusta County. And so everybody's vigilant. Know what these things are. If you see them, alert the proper authorities. We have tried eradication techniques with the spotted lanternfly, and we're losing. Avoidance is by far the best way to combat these things. And unfortunately, with our international commerce, it's very difficult. We don't think twice of eastern red cedar in Augusta County, but it's an invasive plant when you go to California. So it doesn't have to be international, it can be within the United States. So that's a tough one. It's everybody's vigilance. And if you recognize these things, alert somebody who's in a position that can take the appropriate actions to make sure it's known where it's showing up. I guess as a sideline, unfortunately, a lot of what we're fighting as invasives now were actually part of programs and introduced. Johnson grass was introduced as the magical hay crop for the southern US, southeastern US. Autumn olives was a soil conservation service program to provide wildlife habitat along fence rows. Multiflora rose was brought in as I think as a fence barrier. So the gypsy moth was someone's bright idea to breed them with silkworms to increase production. So yeah, not everything gets here by accident, but we are, as a society, I think, more aware of it. And that's, if you look, I believe it's the VDAC's website has a list of invasive species, and there's some of them that are ones to watch, and they're doing a better job of looking at the morphology, the reproduction characteristics, and do these plants have potential to be invasive species. Ornamental plantings are a tremendous source of invasives. So we all need to be vigilant.
Thanks, Doug. Being conscious of time, I'm going to try to do a little bit of rapid fire here to get through some of these questions. We have a lot waiting. If we don't get to you, I am going to save these and send them to our panelists so that we can get back with you, because we certainly want to acknowledge your wonderful questions and great feedback and comments from this film. Our next question I'm going to pull is from Gretchen. She stated that she's been a vegetarian for 6 years, in part because of the high environmental costs of raising meat on a large scale. The film portrayed regenerative farming, which had cows grazing in different fields almost every day throughout the year, so rotational grazing. But isn't that really only an option for farmers and ranchers who have enough land to do this? What about others? See, Alexandra, do you want to try that one first?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just my experience so far, I've been working in the Valley and, I actually serve a lot of Virginia. I serve over 23 counties, but that's like a whole economic lesson that we could spend 8 hours talking about, because you have to look at like, well, is it really more profitable for you to overstock if you have to feed hay and all of these other inputs versus having less livestock and like really working hard towards good pasture management? The truth is, with really good pasture management and rotational grazing, you can get a lot more biomass per acre and do a pretty good job. The other thing I think too is we're not just livestock in terms of cattle, but it's possible to raise poultry on pasture on a smaller scale as well. Other ruminants like sheep and goats might need less acreage. So livestock are such a good tool when used effectively. So I don't think it's necessarily impossible. It just requires really good management.
Thanks. We're getting also some questions related to GMOs. The first one related to GMOs is, what are thoughts on the GMO mosquitoes in Florida? That one got some upvotes, so I'll go ahead and put that one out there. And then there was another question on GMOs. Let me see if I can find it down our list here. Why are people so worried about GMOs? Can we use the technology of GMOs to help crop yield and nutrition without creating monocrops?
I'll take a swing at that. So I feel like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he said at one point with GMOs that things have been selected. If you select the plants, the best seeds, and it's been modified, you're doing that. And I get the idea. If you're going in and splicing the genes, that's another thing. But I guess I'm okay with that. I guess the issue with GMOs is when you're splicing the plants and everything, so that way these GMOs can withstand the bombardment of pesticides. That's when it's just like, eh. And then as far as like the GMO mosquitoes, it's like, I get what they're doing there, and that sounds cool, but it definitely it makes me feel like it's a Michael Crichton novel, and potential could be really bad.
Andromeda strain. Yeah, I think one thing also to consider is we're like sacrificing our seed sovereignty to a organization and a company, and whose best interest does the company serve? I don't think it's the people necessarily. I really want to believe in GMOs because when I was like 13, I was like, they made golden rice, so people are getting vitamin C. That's like a miracle. I love that. But the way it's being used today, like Robert said, just as a means to use more pesticides produced by the same company that makes the GMO seeds, like, I'm getting a little tinfoily hat here, but it's alarming to me. I don't love it, honestly.
I guess I always thought, like Robert started out there, that GMO, I don't like that term, genetically modified organism. Every plant we're using is probably genetically modified. We did it through traditional plant breeding. which would take 8, 10, 15 years. But even our heritage tomatoes, they aren't the original tomato. It's ones that somebody chose at some point in time because they tasted better. And that's what they started growing. And the terminology that is in conflict should have been called genetic engineering. It's where you're actually working at the gene level with a manipulative invasive technique. What Alexandra was alluding to was making crops resistant to pesticides. But a good example is your BT vegetables. They figured out a way to take BT, which is a naturally occurring protein, insert it into the plant and make it resistant to certain insects. And one professor at a class at Virginia Tech, she walks in the classroom and holds up 2 squash. And the first one she holds up and said, this is a genetically modified squash. How many people would like to eat it? And very few people raise their hand. She holds up the other one and said, this is a non-GMO squash. How many people want to eat this one? They mostly raise their hands. She says, what if I told you that this GMO squash was never sprayed with an insecticide? And she said, it holds up the non-GMO. This squash was sprayed 5 times with an insecticide to get this quality of fruit. So there's usually 2 sides to most stories, and it goes back to the economic impact, how it's positioned, and what the motive is.
Thank you all. Next question I have for you. One of the main themes of the movie, what do you say is the most serious issues related to soil and food, but in our area?
I kind of feel like with soil and food, I feel like trying to answer that, but just kind of like on two different levels. Because with food wise, I think one of the biggest issues, especially around here, and this is what a lot of the work that Project Grows does, is food access, getting food to people. Project Grows was started when the health and a bunch of partner organizations did a study and found that there were a lot of folks facing food insecurity and high rates of childhood obesity. So they wanted to get good nutritional food to more folks. And then as far as soil is concerned, I'll leave it with the other folks to answer more about the larger scale farms. But I think I'm going to put on a different hat. I'm involved with the Lewis Creek Committee. And we're worried, we're looking at the watersheds in the Stanton area, and a big thing that we're talking about are riparian areas. So just biodiversity along these corridors where the water is, to help with the water quality. And if everything is just being developed and everything's knocked down, and there's less biodiversity, then of course you're going to have issues with just soil everywhere.
Keep it on your farm. If I'm driving after rain and the creek looks like chocolate milk, it breaks my heart. That's my number one issue for sure. Soil loss in general.
Alrighty. It's 8 o'clock, so I'm going to give you all one more question, and then I'm going to save our chat because we have lots of wonderful questions in here. Y'all have certainly making us work hard this evening. Lauren's asking, related to soil, topsoil loss and erosion are mentioned many times during the film. What are your opinions on what to do about erosion and topsoil loss as well? Where do you see this problem in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, Robert earlier was talking about his red clay, and the truth of that is he didn't have topsoil. What he had was subsoil that was now his topsoil. And, seeing as how difficult that stuff is to work with, you can't get that nice silty texture back. You can add organic matter, which can help, but if we continue to move in the right direction and folks soil health doesn't just go away as a hot topic, we can really boost our soils and make them better and just make the most of what we have. I think that's kind of what we're stuck with. Just here in the Shenandoah Valley, we've lost historically as much as 6 inches of topsoil in some locations. In other areas of the state, it's much, much, much worse. So 5 to 10 years, I hope we're just treating our soil with more respect and keeping it on the farm. That's my goal. It's my hope.
So when soil is lost, when soil erodes, it goes somewhere, and it's water carrying it off, and it goes into the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look at what around here, it goes into the Chesapeake Bay, and Chesapeake Bay Foundation, they sound more hopeful. If you kind of follow what they do, it's off and on with the health of the Chesapeake Bay, but they're hopeful, and I'm hopeful too. And doing work with the Lewis Creek Committee, and just kind of being way more observant of the watershed systems in this area, hopeful about that too. And I think just as we increase biodiversity, riparian areas, or even if you're a homeowner and you just have kind of a bare lawn, there are things that you can plant to kind of decrease the storm water running off. There's things to do there. And then also, if you're just a consumer, just kind of doing your best and doing some research to try to find local farmers that are practicing these good practice, or doing these things, and figuring out how to support them.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to throw out some food for thought. My soil professor gave us 2 definitions of soil. And he said the edaphic definition is a rock's journey to the sea. And then he said a geologist's definition is a rock gone bad. So my point is, the nature's process is to erode mountains and move it downslope, and it's probably going to end up in an ocean somewhere. Mother Nature always wins. I think our part is to minimize our impact and slow it down so we can enjoy it as long as possible. And then the other thing to remember, the mature physiographic landscape is a peneplain, perfectly flat. All the mountains have eroded and there's no place else for it to go. So we're not going to see it in our lifetime, but like I say, we need to minimize our impact. Do the things, keep what we have in place, so that others can enjoy it for a long time.
Thank you all. It is 8:04. We still have 11 questions we didn't get to, but like I said, I'm going to save them. You'll get a follow-up email from me. Probably we won't be tomorrow, but at least by next week with the answers to these questions from our panelists so that we can get your questions answered. So all of you that are registered, we have your email addresses. Look for that so that you can get some answers to these questions. I thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to open it back up to you all, Robert, Alexandra, and Doug, if you had any final thoughts, closing comments you wanted to make to the group before we end our evening.
Yeah, so I say thank you guys so much. I'm really curious what class you're taking, which required you to be here today, and keep it up. That's great. The last comment I have is just something funny I had with a farmer like last week, when it was just like, I was talking about erosion. I'm like, yeah, and that's why the Chesapeake Bay is a mess. And he's like, Alexandra, the Grand Canyon formed by itself. Like, you can't tell me that people are responsible for all of this environmental destruction. And I just was like, I don't even know where to start with that one. So, good on for you guys for learning more about this topic. It's important that, we know about it, so you don't think that humans aren't responsible for anything, because can't even comment on that anymore. Thanks.
I would just say that the regenerative agriculture, it sounds really nice, and that a lot of times there are a lot of really cool terms being thrown around, but do some research. And then as you do more research, you just kind of figure out that there's more, I don't know, there's a lot more to it. And there's not one answer to all of this. But there's definitely practices that are way better than others. I'd also say that we have a plant sale on May 1st, or not May 1st, but on May 7th. So come check us out, Project Grows.
I think my final answer was probably as good a summation as I can do. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Just one thing, Rachel, real quick. I think if we learned anything from a lot of these discussions, it's that the answer is sometimes not clear cut, like our talking about no-till and agrochemicals and everything. So great job for watching the movie. Just know that these are the questions that folks working in this field, like Rachel, Doug, Robert, and myself, have to answer all of the time. Sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it's really complex.
Perfectly said, Alexandra. Alrighty, everyone. Thank you for your time this evening. We hope you gained a lot of information and insight into these sometimes hot button topics that the film brought up. Food security and the future of our climate and our agricultural systems it affects us all. And as Alexandra mentioned with a great final comment, these questions are sometimes not hard to answer. So thank you all for spending your evening with us. Like I said, we'll follow up with some more answers to these questions next week.